Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, hi, I'm Chef Michael Smith. Welcome to my test kitchen right here in beautiful downtown Fortune on Prince Edward Island. This is the home of all the tastiest flavors and the cheesiest ideas. Today I'm going to share with you some of my all-time favorite recipes and favorite ingredients because today is all about COWS Creamery. Hey, did you know that we make some of the very best cheese in the world right here on Prince Edward Island? You didn't know that? Cue the tape. Bruce Wood with East River Farms is a third-generation dairy farmer. He and his family graze 84 happy Holstein cows on some of the best pasture on the planet. He and the many dairy farmers of Prince Edward Island know that our bright green farm floating in the deep blue sea is the perfect home for cows because the grass really is greener here. Our rolling fields are full of thick, lush, nutritious gourmet cow food. It's so good that the vital fat percentage cheesemakers rely on to gauge milk quality is off the charts. We make a lot of cheese here, but only one was named best in the world. Armand Bernard is the son of a dairy farmer and helps oversee the cheese making. At the dairy, the living milk is gently warmed without pasteurizing it, skillfully retaining beneficial bacteria in the fresh milk. They stay alive and thrive, eventually giving depth of flavor to the cheese. Just like thousands of years ago stored in a calf's bladder, the natural enzyme rennet is then added, splitting the milk into watery whey and raw curds. As the warm curds drain, they're kneaded with salt to develop firmer texture, a step known as cheddaring. The seasoned curds are then packed into molds, pressed into wheels, and then they're locked into their own little mini ecosystem by wrapping in cloth and sealing with tallow. It's still just a freshly made wheel of cheddar though. It's packed with integrity. It's loaded with wisdom passed down by generations of cheesemakers. But the next steps are just as important. This cheese is alive. It needs time to breathe. It needs to age. Since the dawn of time, cheesemakers have known that the best cheeses are alive and made in harmony with their environment. In the south of England and to the north on the Orkney Islands, cheeses are aged in caves. This space duplicates those underground conditions. 10 degrees or so, high humidity, and dark. After a year or so, the cheese's textures and flavors mature, and it's finally time to taste. The moment of truth. So good. Every time I eat this cheese, I'm impressed. It reminds me of a fine wine in the sense that there's nuances of flavor here. There's something going on beyond just cheddar. There's fine wine flavors, there's fruit flavors, there's nut flavors in particular, and richness. You can just taste how good it is. And you don't have to be an expert to enjoy this cheese. Hey, I'm Chef Michael Smith for COWS Creamery with Avonlea cloth-bound cheddar cheese. Here to say, moo. Enjoy your cheddar, folks. Avonlea cloth-bound cheddar cheese, truly extraordinary. Of course, this isn't the only cheddar cheese, though, that COWS Creamery makes, so let's try a recipe using apple tree smoked. Apple tree smoked. So this is a cheddar cheese, Prince Edward Island's best dairy, and then smoked with applewood. Really good stuff. Perfect for a potato bacon cheddar tart. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. And you know this recipe is going to go well because it starts with 2 pounds of bacon. This recipe is actually the single most popular recipe that I have ever come up with. I did a version of this recipe on my menu at the Inn at Bay Fortune 25 years ago. My opening menu there in 1992 included a potato bacon cheddar tart. And it really took off from there. And then somewhere, I don't know, the recipe got published quite a few times. And then somewhere about 10 years ago, you remember all that bacon craze going back a few years? Well, this blog in the States picked up on it, and it just went exponential. And next thing you know, it's in Gourmet, and it's in Bon Appetit, and you're seeing it everywhere. So pretty proud of that. And really at heart, though, it's just an example of good, straightforward, simple cooking. 3 ingredients: potatoes, bacon, and really good cheddar cheese. So the first step is to start with a non-stick pan. I'm of course using a Meyer cookware non-stick pan. This pan's made right here on Prince Edward Island with state-of-the-art materials, but any good non-stick pan will work for this recipe. Canadian made, hopefully. And then it's all about lining it with the bacon. So of course bacon is very flexible, you can see already. And what I'm trying to do is line to the center. So every single slice of this thin cut bacon, don't try using thick cut on this, way too much bacon. Every single slice is aligned with the center. So imagine the center of your pan, imagine the center of your bacon, and every single piece has got to point directly at that center. But if every single piece touches the center, then you're gonna have too much bacon in that center. So stagger your pieces a little bit. Pull them back. Some of them touch the center. There's one going all the way. And then the next one, pull it back a little ways. Another key point to keep an eye on is as you go around the outside of the pan, watch your rim. So here we go again. Straight to the center, not quite touching it, but very careful to touch every single slice overlaps along the way. You've got to get that full overlap along the rim. Okay, and then it's just taking your time, getting to know 2 pounds of bacon. So again, right to center, making sure I'm overlapping here on the side. And of course the bacon's going to warm up on you very quickly. It's going to come up to room temperature and it's going to be super stretchy, and that's just the way it is. So take your time. In essence, you're creating the outside of the tart right now with all this bacon. And again, and somehow working with 2 pounds of bacon, there's something decadent about this. I think part of the reason why this recipe is so popular is that, quite frankly, it's a showstopper. You show up with this at a buffet or a potluck, you win. And I love all the times I've met folks over the years that have shared with me their experiences making this dish. I mean, that's quite thrilling. You know, you write these recipes, you put them out in the universe, and you never quite know whether they're going to land or not. And then you meet somebody and they say something like, oh yeah, man, that potato bacon cheddar tart, that's become a part of our Thanksgiving tradition. We make it every year with the kids for Thanksgiving. And that feels really good. You know, that's really cool when your ingredients, when your ideas, when your recipes can become a part of some other family's traditions. That's pretty cool. Here we go. So again, I'm taking my time, super careful, every single piece going right to that center, at least lined up with the center. You don't want to end up with this sort of weird pile of bacon. And I think by now, if you look closely at the center and you see the way this stagger effect works, you can see what I'm avoiding. It's just this giant, thick pile of bacon in the center. If all, what is this, like 30, 40 slices of bacon, we're all touching the center, sitting on top of each other, that's just, well, I can't believe these words are about to come out of my mouth, but that would be too much bacon. And 2 pounds just seems to be the perfect amount. Get you all the way around the outside of that pan, slight overlap on every single slice. There we go. And there we go. So that's what 2 pounds of bacon looks like. Take a moment, just sort of flatten it down in the center too. Trying to avoid that big thick bit there. Hand wash. Keep your hands clean as you go. Okay, step one complete, the bacon lined pan. Moving on to step 2, let's fill it up with potatoes and cheddar. And to do that, you've got to slice your potatoes as thinly as you possibly can. Now, since this is a test kitchen, I've got every tool known to man, and this is what's called a mandolin. This is a classic cutting tool. It's found in classic kitchens all over the world. You don't have to plug it into anything, and boy, can you slice thinly with this. Now, what if you don't have a mandolin in your test kitchen? Well, no worries, just slice the potatoes as thin as you possibly can. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. So, here we go. Yeah, there we go. You can see how thin those are. Because at this point, it doesn't matter. Do your best with a knife, that's just fine, or a Ben Reiner if you have one of those type of cutting tools. But what matters is that you're cutting good potatoes into slices. If the slices are uneven, no big deal. So here we go.
Salt and pepper.
The next step is to layer those potatoes into the pan. I think I'll get a head of steam up first though, get a whole bunch sliced and ready. If you are going to use a mandolin, it goes without saying, be super careful. This is, without question, one of the most dangerous tools in the kitchen. Take your time. I really shouldn't be talking while I'm doing this right now. That's what distracts you when you're working with this. A lot of cooks call this the flesh eater right here. Single most dangerous tool in the kitchen. And that's why I suggest, hey, if you've got one, use it. If you don't, just use a regular knife. Like, no big deal. Look, I'll show you. Just slice it thin. It doesn't matter. So maybe it's a little mixed up. Maybe one's thicker than the other. It just doesn't matter. Just slice them as thinly as you possibly can. And then start layering them into the pan. We're going to slightly overlap each slice. Slightly overlap. Get one single layer into this pan, and don't obsess over what this looks like right now. The bacon matters, but the potatoes don't. The potatoes are going to be hidden in the center of the tart. You can make the prettiest rose pattern in the world, and no one is ever going to see it. All you need to do right now is just get a layer of potatoes in there. There we go. Pat it down, make sure it fits right into the corners on the outside of the pan, and then salt and pepper. A little bit on every layer. And last but not least, COWS Apple Tree Smoked Cheddar Cheese. So this is awesome cheddar cheese that is actually smoked with apple wood. Takes on a beautiful smoky flavor. Cheddar cheese in general is wonderful for smoking, and so it works really well with the bacon. Now, as you put the cheese on, pay attention here as well. You can see what I've done. I haven't done a thick layer. It's more of a thin layer. I can still see the potatoes shining through here and there. Don't want to completely cover it too much. So there's one layer. At this point, it just becomes about fill up that pan with lots of layers. Today I'm using a russet Burbank potato, legendary Prince Edward Island potato. These are the sort of potatoes that are great for baking, or they often end up in French fries as well. We grow a lot of potatoes on PEI that end up in French fries, but they're even better in a potato bacon cheddar tart. Of course, you can use any potato at all to make this. As long as you can slice it thinly, you're gonna make a great dish. I find the russet Burbanks, though, good baking potatoes work best. They tend to be a higher starch potato, and the tart holds together better that way. Okay. I must have done this 1,000 times in my life. This is one of I mean, when I first put this on my menu back in the 90s, nobody had invented the internet yet. You know, viral, what was that? It was just a really popular dish, you know, and people would come back and say, hey, you still got that potato pie thing you were doing? And we said yes, and it became a signature over time. And we would serve this dish with a variety of sort of salads and the like, you know, maybe an arugula salad or something on the side with pickled red onions or something, just flavors that go well with potatoes, bacon, and cheddar. It was always a popular dish. And then somebody invented the internet, and then it really became popular. Okay, a little bit of pepper. Touch of salt on those potatoes again, almost forgot. There we go. And then a thin layer of that cheddar cheese. Not too thick, not too thick. You don't want it sort of oozing out and bubbling out and making a big mess. Just a little bit goes a long way when the cheddar's this good. And then just keep on layering. It's a simple construct. This is really easy to pull together and make it happen. It just takes a little bit of time, you know. It's a showstopper. You get what you pay for, so to speak. You know, put the time in, get those spectacular results. So once you reach the top of the pan, when it feels like the filling is level with the top of the pan, you're not done yet. Because of course, the potatoes will shrink in the mold, so we've got to mound a bit. To make that work really well though, the idea is to sort of stagger the next few layers as we do it. Just sort of bring them in a little bit, not quite out to the full edge. Here's what I mean. So when you reach the top layer, so once you fill the pan, you still need to go a little bit higher because the potatoes will shrink. And those last couple of layers need to sort of stagger in from the edges a bit, sort of mound up a bit. Here's what I mean. So rather than going all the way to the outside edge, I'm just tucking it in a little bit this time. There we go. And that just sort of accounts for the shrinkage as it goes down. And you got some extra potato slices. Feel free to use them up. Don't want to waste anything, just slap them right on, layer them on. Nobody's going to see it. It might seem a little messy to you. You've been building this beautiful layered tart and all of a sudden you start slopping it up at the top. But again, nobody's going to see. Just make sure they're seasoned. There we go. Hard to make the potato ends work. Okay, so there's step 2. Filled it up. And now for step 3, fold all that bacon back over the center. Start with any one of the pieces, come back to center, every piece in a straight line, and do your best not to stretch it too much. You don't want to pull it all the way over to the other side of the pan. Just back to center, lightly covered. Do your best. If the bacon is a little bit shredded, no worries, just do your best. There's so much bacon here, it's going to work just fine. Every single slice, back to center. Nice and flat, back to center. Sort of clean this up once it's all folded. And of course, that bacon will be so stretchy at this point. Don't sweat it though, just make sure it lays flat. Because you're actually looking at the bottom of the tart right now. Believe it or not, later we're gonna flip this bad boy right over. It's kind of unavoidable at this point. This bacon is stretchy. There's nothing you can do about it. Just roll with it. Don't sweat it. I'll show you the trick. Okay. So at this point, you can see the effect that we were trying to avoid on the bottom of the pan, that big thick base of bacon. But because this bacon is sitting on top of the tart, the heat of the oven is going to get to it, it's going to render, it's going to cook just fine. But what we don't want it to do is have all those little ends start to pull back in the first few minutes of cooking. So instead, we've got a trick for that. Just grab a standard issue, small plate, set it right on top, comme ça. There we go. Next step, 3 hours, 350 degrees. And put it on a tray. This is gonna bubble and leak and make a mess in your oven if you don't have it on a tray. See you later, tart. So, at the 2-hour mark, we're gonna take a look at it. We'll have a lot of fat will have gathered around the edges. We'll pour off that fat so that the bottom can start browning. For now though, potato bacon cheddar tart looking good. Let's move on to Oysters 101. Consider the oyster. And there's a lot to consider here. First, this is a raspberry point oyster. This is one of the finest oysters we raise on Prince Edward Island. Awesome brand, awesome oysters, great bay where these are raised. And so let's look a little closer. So we've got the flat, the top shell, we've got the cup, the bottom shell, we've got the round end and the hinge end. That cup though, boy, it's all about that cup. The oyster fishermen work really, really hard to make sure the oyster ends up with that beautiful, deep, pronounced cup. It's not random, it's not incidental, it doesn't just happen, it takes real work and passion. And that's what the folks at Raspberry Point are doing. And that cup is all about eatability. Here's how to slurp and shuck. Here we go. So, your knife is going to work its way anywhere into that hinge, anywhere at all. When it's time to shuck, find your hinge, find a spot in there where your knife just sort of fits in. And now here's the secret. And the best part about oyster shucking is that there's actually a secret. This is never a lever. It's a key in the lock. It's a strong twist. That's what opens the oyster. Check it out. So into that hinge I go. And before I do, actually I want to protect my fingers a little bit. So when I shuck oysters, I use black towels because that hides the mess. Oyster shucking can be a little messy, to protect my fingers. So I place the oyster right where I want it, and then I protect my fingers behind this towel. I find that hinge. Anywhere you can work your way into that hinge is the right place. There's no right or wrong here, as long as you can find a spot. And then the twist. Here we go, the twist. Boom. So what I just did was broke the muscle that's right below my finger, the scallop of the oyster. It is always exactly 2/3 of the way down the oyster, just to the side of the midline. I know it's right below my finger. I've shucked 50,000 oysters. I know where that muscle is, right there. And so that informs what I do next. Wipe the tip of my blade off. Now that I'm in the shell, I'm going above the oyster. I don't want to gouge into the oyster, so I'm going to go across right to this point. There I go. And right there I am. There's my knife underneath. And now it's actually more of a scrape. It's a scrape, not a cut. It's more of a scrape right across that shell. I just cut that scallop muscle. You can see it right there. There it is. Of course, I haven't cut the bottom of it, so the muscle's attached, but the oyster's not. See how the oyster's just sitting there in the shell? The only thing we're fighting is that little scallop muscle right there. So I find it useful to turn it back to me, and again, underneath it with a scrape. That's it. Now, Part of the code when you're shucking an oyster, before you hand it to somebody else, always double check that you don't have any little bits of shell in it, and double check that the oyster has actually been released, that it's ready to slurp and chew. And the chew is essential, of course. The chew is what kills the oyster, so it's not swimming around down there. But more importantly, the chew is how you taste the oyster. And you'll taste two very distinctive things. The brininess, the sweetness of the oyster, the natural flavor of a Prince Edward Island oyster. And in the middle of it, that little scallop muscle that you just fought, that scallop is sweet and it's chewy and it's a delicious contrast to the rest of the oyster. So, oh, it's so good. The first oyster is yours. Keep both those shells, flip them over on any surface whatsoever, anything festive that you have. And then here's how to present a dozen or so oysters. First I shuck. And save your top shells. Mother Nature has given you the perfect way to present the oyster. You can use any surface whatsoever. Just alternate your shells as you go around. Alternate. And the reason for that, because the shells will help you present the oyster level so that you don't spill any of what we call the liquor, the moisture that's in that oyster. We don't want to spill a single drop of it. It belongs to our guests. It's delicious. It represents the freshness of the oyster. It represents the work of the fishermen. It belongs to our guests. You should not waste it. You certainly should not pick up the oyster and pour off the juice. We see that at our oyster bars sometimes. Prince Edward Island is just a great big sandbar out here floating in the ocean. And that's why our oysters are so legendary, because our groundwater does not pick up strong mineral flavors, and that's what ends up flavoring the oyster, is the water that flows out into those estuaries. And on Prince Edward Island, that water arrives sweet and neutral, and so the natural flavor of the oyster can really shine through, the natural sweetness, the natural brininess, the natural freshness. And that's why Prince Edward Island is such an awesome place for oysters. At the Inn at Bay Fortune, our oyster bar is open 1 hour a day. We call it Oyster Hour, and you get to slurp all you like because we're not keeping score. We encourage oyster consumption. What we are doing is building a pile of oyster shells. Every year we pile up our shells just to see how many shells we can accumulate. And in 2019, we hit 56,000. 2020, 13,000. 2021, we're pushing 40,000. It's a good year on PEI. Now you can serve these any way you care to with whatever your favorite topping happens to be. But here's how we do it at the Inn at Bay Fortune with grown-up slushy. Behold the legendary Bloody Mary Ice. A properly crafted Bloody Mary. All the ingredients are there. Everything that would normally be in a Bloody Mary, including the vodka, which is local of course, and sugar. We add a touch of sugar to it. And by adding sugar to it, it doesn't freeze rock solid. Grown-up slushy. A perfect topping on top of an oyster. Look at that. So the idea, of course, is that the oyster is nice and cold, nice and chilly, nice and fresh. And so what could be better than a touch of ice on top of that oyster? This is the Bloody Mary ice that made the Inn's oysters famous. This is how we serve them each and every single night. Just sort of dressed up a little bit with a bit of cold ice on top. And it just kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Cold chili oyster, cold chili topping. And there it is. Prince Edward Island's best Raspberry Point oysters with Bloody Mary ice. Let's see how that tart is doing now. So at the 2-hour mark, quite a bit of juice gathers around the outside. The cheese releases moisture, the bacon releases fat, and we poured all of that off. So now 3 hours in, it's done cooking, and here comes the most interesting part of all. Can you flip it? Here we go. This moment always worries me a little bit. And now for the reveal, and this of course is why we use a non-stick pan. Let's see how we did. Beautiful. Beautiful, look at that. Potato bacon cheddar tart. Let's get a good thick slice going. You can really start to see the layers here, and after 3 hours of cooking, you can bet those potatoes are nice and tender. And feel free to serve this with any little side salad of your choice. Any dressing works. Just a little bit of light vegetables on the side. Beautiful. And there it is, my famous potato bacon cheddar tart from the test kitchen on Prince Edward Island. So what exactly is a recipe? I mean, where do they come from? How do you write them? How do you develop a recipe? Well, I mean, with 1,000 published recipes, from my perspective, it's a pretty straight ahead process. And it does start in a test kitchen environment like this one. And for me, though, it always begins with what I call the promise. So the promise, well, it could be as simple as the title of the book, Farm, Fire, and Feast. Recipes from the NFA Fortune. Well, that's what this book is about. I better deliver on that promise. Or another one of my books, the title is Real Food, Real Good. In other words, this one's obviously going to be about healthy cooking, nutrition, all that sort of thing. In other words, deliver on the promise. So whatever the title is, it's a promise, and that's the way I see it. And so for this particular recipe that I'm developing, this one is still in development, and it's heading into our next cookbook. And the next cookbook is going to be called Farmhouse Vegetables. So obviously, lots of vegetables, lots of payoff. And this one, well, I want to use cauliflower. I want to make a cauliflower mac and cheese, and I want to use a really good particular cheese, Avonlea cloth-bound cheddar. And so there's the promise, cauliflower, mac, and cheese. Well, it better taste like cauliflower, and it better be good and cheesy if it's using Avonlea cloth-bound. Okay, so then develop the recipe. What do you want to do? Well, I've made lots of mac and cheese in my life, and of course there's always a cheese sauce in that recipe. But this time I did things a little bit differently. The recipe uses 1 head of cauliflower. We chopped it all up, saved half the florets, and everything else went into this pot with the milk, simmering away. Cauliflower trim, half the floret, so about 2/3 of a head of cauliflower in here. The whole head is here except for these florets that we reserved. And so now let's make a sauce. And this is the first major thing that's different in this recipe, and is trying to make the sauce flavored with cauliflower. There we go. Now, pureeing hot things, be very careful. Make sure your air vent is open. Let's see how we did. Okay. So, looks like a good thick cream sauce, just like really any macaroni and cheese that I've ever made. And so at this point, what's primarily of concern to me is the amount of volume. Did we make enough cheese? Is it going to rationalize, would be the word we use. In other words, do all the amounts fit together? So to finish this sauce, got lots of finishing ingredients.
Lots of flavor. I like to add a little bit of mustard. Classic ingredients, a little bit of paprika, salt of course. Now normally I add garlic to the cream sauce. Normally I add lots of garlic to a mac and cheese. But I'm just now realizing that, well, this is why we develop recipes, because in the past my method would have called for grating the garlic into the sauce. Right now, microplane grater, great way to treat garlic, great way to get all that flavor, super quick. But as I do this, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, why didn't I just throw the garlic in the blender? I just blended this sauce. Why wasn't the garlic in with the cauliflower? Why didn't I just throw it in the blender? Why am I adding this step right now? Why am I being needlessly specific would be the term, something that we try to eliminate from recipes. So this is what a test kitchen environment is all about. Little discoveries like this one and taking notes. I can tell right now that step has got to go. So let's get rid of microplane grated. Let's just simmer the garlic and then puree the garlic and save you a step. Make it simple. Okay. And that's often what it's like when you're creating a recipe. You're looking for ways to add your own personality, to make it fit the concept of the book, to pay off on the promise. And so I'm looking at this beautiful sauce. It looks just like any creamy cheese sauce I've ever made before. The cheese isn't in yet, but no worries there. Avonlea cloth bound, of course, world's best cheddar cheese. Melts right into that sauce. And at this point, pretty standard. I mean, this is how mac and cheese is made. You begin with a cheese sauce, tasty, everything's in it that would normally be there, except that this time, there's a little bit of a secret. Instead of flour and butter and thickening up the cream sauce, instead this time, cauliflower puree. Cauliflower puree. So with any luck, it's going to have more cauliflower flavor as a result. And if we don't like the taste, well, we'll just do it again. Try it with more cauliflower. That's what test kitchens are all about. Okay, so there's my cheese sauce, good to go. This is just how it's done, right? So in goes the macaroni. Stirred together. And the reserved cauliflower, which of course is raw. So we've got the cooked cauliflower puree, and I've got the raw cauliflower as well, and a nice high ratio of it. That's what I'm conscious of right now. You wouldn't want the recipe to say, hey, it's cauliflower mac and cheese, and then you're searching all over for the cauliflower. You can't see it or you can't taste it. So in this case, I'm looking and I'm thinking, yeah, good high ratio. I can see lots of cauliflower. So in it goes. Okay, pretty standard again at this point, pretty straightforward, macaroni and cheese, cauliflower variation. I still need a crust. And in kicks yet another idea. And again, this is how test kitchens work. This is an environment where we track everything, where we measure everything, measure temperatures, measure weights, everything gets measured here. Crazy measurements where we write down the notes, the things that we learn on the way. And I know from long experience writing recipes, the single most difficult part is tracking all the information. So here's another variation I wanted to try. Instead of just a standard breadcrumb topping, let's make a rye breadcrumb topping, which of course means, well, rye bread, but what makes rye bread taste like rye bread? Caraway seed. So let's up the flavor. In goes the caraway seed. Little bit of butter is always a good idea when you're making your crust, that little bit of fat and the bread working together. Speaking of fat, why not add some of the cheddar cheese to the breadcrumb mixture? Why not? And all the times that I've ever written a recipe for mac and cheese, I've never thought to try this. Put a little bit of cheese with the breadcrumbs. Let's see what we get. Looks good to me. And the volumes seem right. It's nice and you can feel the moisture in it, which means the fat, which means it's going to brown off nice. and the volume seems to work. This all adds up. It's going to fit a standard pan here. Okay, so now it becomes about things like, well, what temperature should we bake it and how long should we bake it, and sort of those kind of mundane details. But really what's going on here is just a basic cooking process, tracking the steps as you go, feeling free to try new ideas, writing down the things that you learn, and making sure above all that whatever that title is, you're paying off on it. I actually threw one of these in the oven earlier. Let's see how it tastes. Here's another example of what we might do in a test kitchen. Look at the shape of these two pans. They're both different, but they're both very common in home kitchens. So we need to be sure that the recipe fits all types of pans, that this is a good amount of the recipe. You know, sometimes a recipe, you gear up and you do all the things for the recipe and you end up with like 3 portions. So what was the point? It's just as easy to make enough for 12 as for 3. So that's another thing we're thinking about. We're going through all this effort, making a cauliflower sauce. Is there enough? Is this worth it? Is the payoff right here and real? I think it is. This is going to be enough for, 6, 8 people can eat this. The real payoff though is the flavor. Ooh, that's a good sign. Nice crisp crust. There we go, steaming. Doesn't look to be overcooked. Haven't tasted it yet, but I sure can smell cauliflower. And let's see. Oh. Oh yeah. Delicious. So, the promise, cauliflower mac and cheese, okay? Definitely mac and cheese, definitely taste the cauliflower, definitely delicious. In particular, the cheese in that crust. Wow, look, that's the cheese making it nice and crispy. Now this recipe is not done with development yet, and this book's not gonna be out for 2 more years, so we're gonna run this through the process at least 1 more time. Make sure all the amounts are correct, everything adds up, everything's rationalized, and at the end of the day, make sure we're paying off on our promise. Because ladies and gentlemen, when you're cooking with the very best, like COWS Avonlea cloth-bound cheddar cheese, you gotta get it right. Here I am, Chef Michael Smith in my test kitchen right here on Prince Edward Island, super thrilled to share with you some of the best ingredients in the world. And of course, around here, it's all about the Signing out, Prince Edward Island.